Our message this morning, I already kind of hinted at the beginning of service. We're kind of on the last couple laps of this series in James. And next week we'll be talking about prayer. Last week we talked about condemnation and warning the wealth, being wise about the wealth that we have. But now we're discussing the topic of patience and suffering. And so we'll be in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12 this morning. Patience and suffering. I'll read. My bookmark was on the wrong page because I was writing expository outlines this week. Here we go. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. As Dr. Ronald Blue, whose commentary I've relied on heavily through for my outline specifically throughout this series, along with Warren Wiersbe. But Dr. J. Ronald Blue points out, he says, from the rich, James now turns to the restless. For these, he again uses the friendly address, brothers. We saw in chapter 2:5, he said, listen, dear brothers. But the tone turns from stark condemnation to sensitive consolation. He appealed his brethren to be patient. And the means by which he did this was to define the essence of patience, give examples of patience, and then indicate the effect of patience. So the essence of patience he articulates in verses 7 through 9. He begins, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer awaits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until he receives the early and late rains. Be patient in Greek is a compound word that comes from words long and temper. So the idea is to sort of set a timer of one's temper for a long run. Think about, think big picture, think long term. Focus on the final lap in the race of one's life. It's about having a long fuse and looking ahead to the Lord's arrival. And the essence of patience is furthermore seen in the farmer who patiently waits for the rain in his crops. And it says, you also, he's waiting for his crops to grow, for that precious fruit. So what is the essence of patience? The essence of patience is a joyful waiting on the promises of God to be fulfilled and the fruit of life in his will. I remember my first time trying to fast, because I kind of neglected that as a Christian discipline. It wasn't until probably college that I had a teacher who really stressed the idea. And I thought it was kind of silly and borderline unhealthy, at times. And so I was very confused by it. But it is a Christian discipline nonetheless. And and I decided I would try it out, see what it's all about. And I only did a day long. It's all I could muster up at the time. Plus my more scrawny stature, I was kind of worried. But nonetheless, just today I thought I'd try it out. And you're supposed to, every time you feel hungry, kind of be led to prayer. But even I couldn't really pray. I was too angry, by being hangry, as they say. I'm so hungry and irritable. I can't concentrate on my prayers, And so I'm I don't get this. This seems silly, and I even towards the end there I didn't get it. But then when I took my first bite, I understood, because I certainly appreciated that more. I appreciated the satisfaction therein. We wait for the precious things of God often in life. There are so many precious moments that we wait for. The majority of life is not the good parts. It's a mix of good and bad, but the vast majority is kind of like the monotonous part, the necessary part, There are certain moments where it hits you and kind of when I finally got to eat, I just got this, you get this overwhelming feeling of this is what it's all about. This is what it's all about. I remember my first phone call with Kaylee, because we had messaged for a little while. But then when we first had our phone call, we talked on the phone for 5 hours. It was till 4 a.m. or something crazy like that on the phone. I remember Elijah's first time beating me in basketball or golf. And it's it's not that I don't want this to happen. It's this is why we play. He gets to this point and you're kind of this is what it's about. Now the golf thing it didn't happen last time, but maybe keep trying. You'll beat me one of these days. And then I think of my time, here at the church, these moments where I'm this is what it's all about. Easter, coming in to the church, thinking I was getting here really early for the sunrise service. And of course, Christine and Audra are already there, preparing breakfast. I think of, the way you guys treated me for, Pastor Appreciation Month, or when you collected things from my home, or, for my birthday even, or visiting Shirley and getting to sing together. This is what it's all about. I got a couple days ago, I had a phone call with a friend of mine he's an Anglican priest, and he's my age, and we were in school together, and he's just now about to start in his own parish. That's what they call their churches. His own parish in Georgia. And he's telling me, he's there's about 12 of them, and they're all older. And I was hold it right there. I was let me tell you something. And I just told him, get ready, because you're going to be overwhelmed by how much you love them. It's something they can't teach you in school. How much I love you. And those feelings when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm thinking about you, this is what it's all about. That's what it's all about. These little precious fruits of life. Or even our larger deliverances that God gives you. Maybe not even those precious little moments. Either way, but we've got to look to those as an encouragement to what we're looking towards ultimately, which is the arrival of Christ. Or maybe our arrival to Him, whatever comes first. But these little moments give us that we wait for. It is the essence of patience is waiting for these little moments. And being able to understand God's providence in the suffering times until then. I worked yesterday from 6 to 12, and I got there about 7 minutes late. I hated that I did that. Set my clock wrong. So I was kind of frustrated. I was getting there. I was getting there late. I left the house late. It was dark and dark out. But on the way to work, I saw a shooting star. I'm not even kidding. And it was beautiful, and it was a little moment, and I would have missed it if I wasn't, if I wasn't looking up, and if I had relied too much on my frustration with being late, and didn't take the time to look up. And there's little times in your waiting and in your suffering where you're so focused on your suffering that you don't take the time to look up or think like, well, maybe there's a reason why I'm late. Maybe I'm supposed to see something here. This is patience. Not getting too caught up in the suffering, but looking up. It is a joyful waiting on the promises of God to be fulfilled and the fruits of life in His will. You see, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until he receives the early and late rains. And of course, this all points to what we're really waiting for, which is pointed out. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So the application is made clear here. Just like the farmer, every believer should be patient and stand firm because the Lord's arrival is near. Or again, our arrival to Him. But either way, that first bite's coming. And so you can hold out a little longer. Verse 9 says, "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." This is kind of a side note a little bit that I feel like is almost added on, but worth mentioning. In view of the hope of Christ's soon return, believers are called also to cease their petty conflicts that they have with one another. Don't grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. The judge is standing at the door. I think of being in school when your teacher would leave the classroom. And the school I went to, when my teacher would leave the classroom, we had this one group of guys tossed this one kid's, not just his books. They tossed his desk out the window. and it's a first floor for one-story building. So, but still, they tossed his desk and his books out the window. And then when the kid goes out to get it, he kind of crawls out the window to go get his stuff. They close and lock the window. So he has to go all the way around the school, which he finds out is locked. And meanwhile, the whole class can see all of this happen from the windows. So that's what happens when the teacher walks out of the class for a second. Not only that, there are things drawn on the board, and it sounded like we were in a farm. There was these little toys little skateboards called tech decks that we would play with, and they would be flying up in the air. It was a circus when the teacher left the room. But I remember one time she left the room, and this sort of ruckus took place. And she walked back in. She just started writing names down. And she looked at us and said, "I was at the door the whole time." We think sometimes because we can't immediately feel the presence of God in the midst of our suffering, or we feel like David felt that He's turned His face away from us for a moment. No, he's at the door the whole time, right? The judge is standing at the door. We all went to the ISS office that day. Now, we didn't all get suspended, but it was, to teach us a lesson. The judge is standing at the door, and we should behave accordingly. And so, do not grumble against one another, brothers. Grumbling is not patience, just because you're waiting. It's like you may be waiting, but if you're not waiting in joy, that's why I added that when I said that, articulated the essence of patience. A joyful waiting on the promises to be fulfilled of God. Because grumbling, just because you're waiting, is not patience. Quit your grumbling. Quit the petty conflict. The judge is at the door. Now for some examples of patience in verses 10 and 11. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. James reminds his Jewish brothers of the prophets who had to endure a great deal of suffering in order to be patient. And be patient in the midst of it, Think of the prophets, he says. And then he says, behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purposes of the Lord, and how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. He brings up the prophets. He brings up Job and their suffering. Think about that. And yet we consider them blessed who had to endure that suffering, because they endured it patiently. And I try to do this sometimes in my preaching. I try to do it often in my preaching, right? I talk about Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, or other martyrs like Stephen. I talk about people who deal with things that we've dealt with, who've gone before us. Spurgeon and Cowper with their battles with depression. I encourage us, just like James is encouraging them, to think of the prophets and of Job. I encourage you to look at the saints of old for examples on how to be patient right now. Think of the wisdom of Corrie ten Boom, right? Her and her family saved so many Jewish people during the Holocaust. And she once said of patience, worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow, it empties today of its strength. And think of what she did. And this is the kind of wisdom that we get from individuals who have gone before. And to not think of those individuals, we rob ourselves of the wisdom that they can bring to our present moment, like Corrie ten Boom there. So why is it crucial to rely on the examples of the heroes of the faith, the prophets of Job, or of the folks that I mention on a given Sunday? Because they understand the truths of the Word. And not only that, have lived it. And such wisdom can teach us of patience. What Scottish missionary to China, William Burns, once said, any suffering, when borne along with Christ, is sweeter than any happiness without him. Or Corrie ten Boom also said, she said, I've experienced his presence in the deepest hell that men can create. I've tested the promises of the Bible, and believe me, you can count on them. And finally, wisdom such as Jim Elliot, as he says, consume my life, God, for it is thine. I seek not a long life, but a full one like you, Lord. This is the sort of wisdom that we can rely on in our patience in suffering, or for patience in suffering, I should say. Because there's been a lot more people throughout the Christendom and throughout the faith who have had to be patient and who have had to suffer and who have had to endure trial. Finally, let's look at the effect of patience. Let's look at the effect of patience in verse 12. But above all, my brothers, Do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Do not swear. Swearing here is not talking about profanity. Rather, it's talking about kind of making an oath. You don't have to make an oath. And the point isn't, not to make vows either, like at your wedding. And the point is not to, when you go to court, don't put your hand on the Bible. It's not saying that. It's not saying you can't do that. That's not the point. It's more like, I think I've told you about my friend Phil growing up. When we would go to the pool, and he'd say, it's okay to jump off the diving board. Like, I've got you right here. I couldn't swim very well. I've got you right here. Or go ahead and slide down. I've got you right here. And then I slide down and he doesn't. And it's just like, this now my trust is disrupted. Because you said something and you didn't follow through on it. And so next time I go to the diving board, I'm begging him. I'm like you've got to get me. Stay right there. Don't move. And but then when he moves again, or he says, I promise. I promise. I won't move. You shouldn't have to promise. You shouldn't have to say, I swear. Because you should be living with such an honesty about yourself that your yes is your yes, your no is your no. Does that make sense? It's not talking about don't make any put your hand on the Bible. It's not saying don't make vows during your wedding. You should be living with such a level of honesty that your yes is your yes, your no is your no. You shouldn't have to plead for someone else's word to be genuine, nor should you have to plead your case that yours is. For those who truly demonstrate the persistence and patience of believers, there is no need to swear by anything. You hear people say all the time, you hear people say, I swear to God. It's like swearing by something you don't know, right? Because he says don't do that. So that's, first off, strike one. Or I've heard people say, I swear on my mama's grave. I prefer Wesley's use of his dad's grave. Remember Wesley was, he would go preaching and he'd be tossed out of places that they didn't like his preaching, right? And even his home church tossed him out one day. And so he said, okay, my dad's grave is right here. It's one plot of land you can't remove me from. So he stood on his dad's grave and he preached from there outside. And there was a greater gathering out there than in the church. He declared truth from it rather than verbally degrading its solemnity. So we shouldn't swear by that either. And you hear people say, I swear on my whole life. Okay. If you're at gunpoint and you have to swear by something, either to God or yourself, choose yourself. Because it means nothing without the prior. But unless that's the case, don't do it. Because Scripture says not to. I remember my sisters, Mary and Hannah, they would tickle me. I was very ticklish growing up. I'm still ticklish, but yeah, they would tickle me till I couldn't breathe, and it'd be frustrating. I'd say stop, and they would say okay, and then they'd start again, and screaming. I can't breathe. And just when I thought they would stop, they would start again. Until it's like, pinky promise, you won't stop. And they pinky promise, But you shouldn't have to get to that point, right? And I know I sound like I'm grasping here. I'm not saying don't pinky promise that's a sin. It sounds like I'm grasping here, but this is the general idea anyway. Your speech should be such that your yes is yes and your no is no. I preached earlier in this series on James' admonition for wisdom of speech. He is very clear that a person's speech provides the most revealing glimpse of their spiritual condition. It's sort of a window, right? Now, you may be asking, well, how does this actually articulate the effect of patience, though? It's like we haven't really talked about patience on this point at any level, and we're saying that this letting our yes be yes, our no be no, and not swearing by heaven or earth by any other oath, we're saying that's the effect of patience. I fail to see where we're making that leap. So it's how does this articulate the effect of patience? I want you to look again at verse 11 for a moment. Just that first line. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. Spurgeon makes a comment here. A person going to a surgeon will bear sharp pain when he is convinced that he will be cured by such pain. If a man proposes to cut me, I decline his offer. But if I know that I will die unless the incision is made, I welcome the knife. Let him cut without mercy if he intends mercy by it. It might be unmerciful to hold back his hand in such a case. It might be unmerciful for him to hold back, to not make that incision. No one's going to invite sharp pain into their life. If someone proposes to cut you, it's like, no thank you. That's easy, right? But if making that incision, if a surgeon must do that in order that you not feel that you will be cured by such pain or a greater pain, then we have something worth talking about, right? We consider those blessed who remain steadfast. There's all sorts of pains of life, and sometimes God puts us through a little bit more. But that's sort of the growing pains, so that we can stop hurting ourselves with our habits and the way that we live, just like physical therapy, I went one time for my back. I didn't, so I'm kind of a hypocrite here, but because it hurt, right? But the point is simply that it does hurt for a little while, so that it doesn't hurt every single time you go to pick something up, for the rest of your life, And sometimes what God does is He puts us through a little bit of pain, a little bit of suffering for a little while, so that He makes that incision, and he cuts without mercy because He intends mercy by it. Because He's a merciful God. He's a merciful surgeon. And it might even be unmerciful for Him to hold back His hand in such a case, rather than letting you make a wreck of your life. And I want to land here. The great surgeon is always at work in you, bearing for you what is unbearable, keeping you sane in such insanity-prompting times as these, keeping your head up when the weight of your weak makes you weak, ever sanctifying, boldening, keeping, convicting, maturing, and cherishing you. as you wait on the fulfillment of his promises, abiding in his will and word, step by step, day by day. Let's pray.